So in this next part, we're going to work on projectile attacks for our character. We'll set up the bow animation. Then we'll create a new trigger, a ranged attack trigger. So we'll be pressing down a different button when we want to cause a ranged attack like a bow shot to happen. And that means we're going to be setting that up on the player input action. And that means we're going to be setting that up on the player input component. And on the release frame of the animation, we want to create an animation event where at that moment in time, we fire the projectile. And we'll be creating the projectile as a kinematic body instead of a dynamic mode rigid body, so that the arrow will ignore all physics except for the movement we set in the script. So first off, inside of the player prefab, we're going to create a new animation. So I'm going to click on the drop down of the animations. Let's go into the assets folder, characters, player, and let's create the player. I guess we could call it player bow or player fire. I'll go with player bow, since maybe you'd have multiple ranged projectiles. So player bow, I'll save that animation, change the samples to 10. And now inside of project, RV Voss Adventurer, we're going to find the bow animation. So frame 0 to frame 8, drag those in, and let's hit play to see it. Okay, so there's our shot animations. So I need to have an arrow appear right at this moment where the wind appears on the bow firing. Now just in advance, I'm going to take this animation and I'm going to turn off looping, because each time you press the bow fire button, we should fire one arrow. So there's no need for that animation to loop. Okay, so on player, animator, let's go ahead and create a new trigger. I'm going to click add trigger, and this will be ranged attack for now. I can move it up the list next to attack just for organizing. And then we have this bow fire. So the bow is something we're going to be firing from ground state. So I can create a transition, make transition to player bow, and player bow back to ground states, state machine, ground states. This exit transition, of course, would just be at exit time 1 and transition duration 0. But the trigger to come into the state is going to be ranged attack. And then in ground states, we can set another exit transition, same as before, where all of our ground states go to the exit. And the reason for that occurring this time is going to be the ranged attack trigger is set to true. And then for has exit time off, transition duration 0. So just make sure you have those same settings for all of them. Transition duration 0, trigger, ranged attack 0, no exit time, transition duration 0, and ranged attack. And that should set up the animator for the player bow. So now we need to set up the import action on the player so that we have a way to set the ranged attack trigger on our animator. So click on player, and let's go down to our player import. I'm going to double click import action asset, and let's add a new action. And I'll call the action, let's say, fire bow. Or actually, I'll rename that, and let's make it ranged attack. If we're only going to have one button to press for all ranged attacks, then this might make more sense for an action name. And then maybe with a more developed platformer character, you could have a way to cycle through which ranged weapon is selected, and then it just fires the selected one with this button. Not something we're going to personally set up in this course, but a direction to head in the future if you want to keep building on top of it. So with ranged attack, let's add in a binding. So I'm going to click on no binding here, and let's do path. Listen to whatever key you want to press. In the reference project, I used F for firing the bow, so that's what I'll use here. I press F and then choose it from the list. Okay, and now we have our keyboard and mouse set up, so I'm going to check that for keyboard and mouse. We use the F key to fire the bow. And let's save that. Now let's go into the player controller script. And we'll need to create a on ranged attack method, which is basically going to be just like this on attack. In fact, we could just copy this if we want. So I'll copy this down there, and let's change the name on ranged attack. So it's still going to be when the button is first pressed down, context started. Then we're going to set the trigger, and it's going to be ranged attack trigger instead of attack trigger. So let's hit control period to generate the ranged attack trigger in the animation strings. Going to right click on it, go to definition, and we'll set the name here. So ranged attack trigger is equal to ranged attack. And just double check and make sure that that matches the animation parameter here. So after verifying that, we need to go look for the Unity events in player input. I'm going to drop down events player, and we have our new one down here, ranged attack. So let's click plus. I'll drag in the player object from the hierarchy to here. And let's choose a script from the dropdown, and we want player controller on ranged attack. So let's hit play, and now we press the F key, And you can see our ranged attack animation plays out. And after the animation is done, we return to the idle states. So that is pretty much working as intended. The only thing is that the character can also move while it is in that state. So we probably want to set something up like we added with ground attack. So we can see that when ground attack is active, can move is set to false. So we want to set up the same set bool behavior on the player bow. So I'm going to click on player bow, add a set bool behavior, and we're just copying the same information over. So the bool name can move, the value on enter is off, and we're updating on state instead of state machine. So state machine here, single state over here. And then the value on exit should be true. Okay, that looks correct. So let's go back out. I'll jump up here to test. I hit F to fire, and you'll see that we can't move while firing. We can reverse direction, which I think is something we probably want, because maybe when you press your arrow fire, you're accidentally charging up in the wrong direction. So this allows the player to kind of reverse their direction and fire the correct way towards the enemy. And I think that makes sense. Okay, now we need to create an animation event to fire the projectile. So that means somewhere on our player game object, we need a component which has a function to fire a projectile that we haven't created yet. So I'll do this kind of like the sword attacks as their own child game object. Let's right click, create empty, and I will call this bow attack. For the bow attack component, let's hit W to go into move mode and offset it to basically where the arrow should be spawning. And to know that, let's go to the animation tab and just look at the bow animation. Find the frame where the arrow should be firing. So right there, let's take the bow attack and just move it down to probably right around here. So this will be where we spawn the projectile. So now we need a new script attached to this bow attack. We can call it something like projectile spawner or projectile launcher. I like launcher, so that's what I'll go with, projectile launcher. Let's edit the script. At the top of the script, we'll need a public game object, projectile prefab. So the projectile that we want to spawn. Then we're going to need a function we can use on the animator events. So that's going to need to be a public function. So public void, I'll call it fire projectile. Nothing for the parameters. And if this event triggers, then we are going to instantiate a copy of the projectile prefab. So when we create the projectile, the second parameter is going to be not the transform of the parent, but the position of the parent's transform. So projectile, So we want transform.position. So for the rotation, we can just get whatever the default rotation on the prefab is. So projectile prefab.transform.rotation. I think we can just set that there. And then the transform parent, we don't actually want a parent game object that this is going to be falling under, or maybe we would if there was some kind of projectile manager in this game. But for right now, I think we can actually just leave that blank. We'll just have these three parameters. The object we're creating a copy of, transform.position for where to spawn it, and then projectile prefab transform rotation, just copying whatever the default rotation is into this new object. Okay, so if we go back out to the game, we should see a slot for the projectile prefab on our projectile launcher. So let's create our new prefab for our projectile. I'm going to go out to the base of the project. Let's right click, create a new empty. So in the base of our project, I'm going to drag this straight arrow modified I have here into the scene. You can double click on it, and then this can be the base shape of our arrow. So I was just editing something to use, kind of basing it on Kaire's RPG icon pack, the arrow 1C and arrow 2C. That's kind of where I got that from. I just made it so that it's facing forward by default, since that's more appropriate for our character to use as an arrow. So I'm going to rename this game object to arrow. Let's add a new component to it, and I'll call it the projectile component. I want to keep it as generic as possible so that we can reuse the component. So let's create the new projectile component, and let's edit the projectile script. So inside of here, we're going to have a float move speed for the projectile. This will just be a consistent speed without any acceleration or anything. And we do want to make that public so that we can customize it in the inspector easily. Let's also make a public int damage. And I'll default that to 10. So we're not going to need the update method. We're just going to need to set the velocity of the rigid body on start. So we'll need to get access to the rigidbody 2D, rigidbody 2D, RB, and then void awake. Let's do RB equals get component rigidbody. And then on start, we'll do RB velocity. It's going to be equal to a new vector 2 with the move speed times the scale of the transform. So transform dot local scale dot x to make sure it's facing the right direction. And then the y velocity, we will set that to 0 for now. Actually, though, you know what we could do? There might be a projectile where we would have wanted to have a y velocity. So let's take the float and let's turn this into a vector for the move speed. So vector 2 move speed, and this will be a new vector 2 3f and then 0 for the default values. So now we can do move speed.x, and then over here we can do move speed.y. So we're going to have the projectile be kinematic by default, but if you want it to be affected by gravity, you could just make it a rigid body in dynamic mode to do that, since that will make the gravity apply automatically. But to make the movement 100% just controlled by this line here, that's why I'm going to do kinematic mode. So no other physics is going to affect the projectile. So when the projectile is moving, we do need to detect when it does enter the collider for, let's say, the player or the enemy, a target that can take damage. So we're going to need a void on trigger enter 2D, which of course means we need some kind of collider shape on the projectile. And then we need to make sure that the target is damageable. So damageable equals get component damageable. We'll check if the damageable does not equal null. And I mean, we can actually just go to the attack script, and we're going to kind of want to check here for that stuff. So we can also add a knockback if we want. But basically, we're just going to be calling the hit function. So why don't we actually just copy this stuff over from the attack script to the projectile script? I'll just paste it in there. And this way we'll be able to have a knockback. So let's add in a public vector2 knockback, and that will default to a vector2 0 0. And then we can do the hit function with the knockback as well. So a projectile has the option of having a knockback. If you don't want it to do any knockback, just make the knockback vector 0, which is the default. Okay, so then we need to pass in the damage of the projectile. So damage to the hit function. And then down here for the debug message, we'll also do damage. That should pretty much be it for our projectile script. Let's turn the arrow into a prefab. I'm going to do it under objects. Let's right click, create a folder. I'll call it projectiles. Double click into it, drag this in. And the assets folder, let's also make sure our new scripts are in the scripts folder. So I'm going to drag projectile and projectile launcher in there. Okay, and now we can remove the arrow from our scene. We just got to go into the prefab for the player. And on bow attack, let's drag in the new projectile. So bow attack, drag an arrow from the project window into the projectile prefab. So this projectile launcher could be used to instantiate a copy of any projectile you come up with. And that's why I left it kind of generic. So let's see how much it's working right now. I'll hit F. So it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't set the triggering event to create or fire the projectile. Let's click on player, animation, and then for bow, we need to create a animation event in here. So we already wrote the fire projectile function. We just need to call it at the right time. So that is going to be the exact moment where our arrow is supposed to be firing. So let's right click, add an animation event in the animation window. Now click on that little notch that just appeared. Make sure it's highlighted blue. Then go to the inspector and we can choose which event to call for that. And that is going to be the fire projectile. So I don't actually see it on the list here, and I think I know why. I think that for the animation event to be called, then the component where you're calling the function from actually has to be on the player. So we don't need to change too much. We're just going to need to take the projectile launcher and put it on the player. So I will drag and drop that over there. We're still going to keep the bow attack for the transform. But now in the player, we have the projectile launcher script. We need to specify which transform we're going to use for the bow attack, because now we don't want to use the player's location. We want to use the bow attack location. So let's edit the projectile launcher, and we'll have a public transform, and I'll call this launch point. And then we need to use launch point dot position when we're instantiating the projectile. So now at the bottom of our player script, we'll see the launch point transform as a slot to put into here. So launch point, we just drag bow attack right into there. We have a transform set, and that'll get used in the script. So that's all we should have to do. Let's hit play. So with that set, let's go to the main scene. I'm going to remove the arrow from here. Let's hit play, and I'll try pressing F to fire an arrow. So we don't actually get the arrow to spawn yet. So of course, now that we moved the script, we need to make sure that we add it to the animation event. So under animation, player bow, let's go to the fire point, right click, add the animation. With that selected, go to the inspector, look for the functions. So we're looking for fire projectile now. So down here at the bottom, we have fire projectile. Okay, good. And let's go ahead and test it. So I'll press play and let's hit F to fire our projectile. So it definitely gets created, but we can see it doesn't have a rigid body attached to it. So we just have to add a couple components. Let's open up the prefab for the arrow. In the inspector, we'll add a rigid body, 2D. Gonna make it kinematic mode. So we're not using the built-in Unity physics to control it anymore. And let's add a component, which is going to be a circle collider. And this is going to be where the arrow can hit a player. So I'm going to hit edit and let's shrink the size of the collider. And then let's also move its offset. I'm going to change the Y to 0. I'll drag the X over to the right. And then we can increase the size a little bit more. Just kind of going to the head of the arrow shape. So that should be good for our collider. Now the last thing we need to do is to change the physics layers to make sure that our projectile can only hit enemies if that's what we're going for. So I'm going to change this to be a player hitbox because I only want to hit enemies with this arrow. Now, one other thing we should add to the projectile script, now that I think about it, if our character did get hit, we want to destroy the projectile. So destroy game object, and we can actually do that after the debug. I want to make sure that that's the last thing that happens so that the debug can actually run. So we'll destroy the game object after the arrow hits because we assume it can't hit multiple targets. But that's obviously an optional thing. You could have an arrow that passes through all the enemies it hits and hits each one. One or more times. So for now, let's go back to the Unity game and let's see if we can fire the arrow. So I'm going to go to play mode. Let's hit F and we have our projectile. Let's see if it hits. Okay, so super OP. It is actually doing physics on the enemy and that's not what we want. So let's look at the arrow again. And the reason for that is that we haven't set the circle collider to is trigger mode. So make sure you do that. We want to damage enemies. We don't want to push through them with infinite force. So let's hit play again. Gonna dodge the attack, hit F to fire an arrow, and let's see if it hits. Okay, object reference not instantiated to an object something something. Okay, right, we can't use the local scale of the parent's transform because there is no parent for the projectile. So we need to use its own local scale. So transform.localscale.x on the projectile. Okay, so let's hit play and test our projectile out. So we can hit the knight. That's cool. Let's also try turning the knockback onto the arrow. So I'm going to open up the arrow projectile and let's give it a insane knockback, like 10. I'll hit play. And then let's try that again. So it's going to hit the knight. And boom, right off the cliff. So there's two problems that are happening right now. One is that the projectile always fires to the right, regardless of which direction the player is changing. So we need to inherit the scale of the player when we fire our arrow. And also I noticed that when we hit the knight into a wall like this, it keeps trying to switch the direction. So we should turn off switching direction when the knight is in the air. So let's take care of the fire direction of the player first. Since the projectile launcher is now a script that we're attaching to the player out of necessity for the animation, we can also use it to inherit the player's transform local scale. So let's go into the script for the projectile launcher. And when we instantiate the prefab, let's get a reference to it over here. So game object, I'll call it, let's just call it projectile. That's the most straightforward. So what we're going to need to do with the projectile is change its local scale based on the parent's local scale at the time of projectile firing. So let's do projectile.transform.localscale, and that's going to be equal to a new vector 3. So this will get kind of long, so we'll put it in 3 lines, I think. So we'll do projectile.transform.localscale. Actually, you know what? We can make this just a vector 3 variable, less typing. So vector 3. I'll call it vector 3 orig for original, and then we'll do scale equals projectile transform local scale. So now when we're getting the values, we can just replace that down here. So we want to take the x, and then we need the original scale dot y, the original scale dot z. So for the Y and Z, we're going to leave that alone. But for the X, we want to multiply that by a new value. So we're going to multiply that by the transform of the player, or the character which the projectile launcher is attached to. The transform local scale dot x, and we're going to see if it's greater than 0 or if it's less than 0. So if it's greater than 0, we're going to multiply it by 1 because it's facing the right direction. Otherwise, we're going to multiply that by -1. So this will allow us to flip the projectile's transform based on which direction the player is facing. So flip the projectile's facing direction and movement based on the direction the character is facing at the time of launch. So as for the other problem, where when we hit the knight off a cliff, its movement's kind of crazy. Let's try turning the knight's movement off entirely when it's in the air. There would be other ways to do it, but I think this is the most straightforward. So let's say if can move and is grounded. So touching directions dot is grounded, then we're going to take the velocity and we're going to accelerate it. Otherwise, we're going to just drop the x velocity towards 0. So let's give that a shot. I'll hit play. Let's hit the knight. Okay, that seemed to work pretty well. So let's hit play one more time. Hit him with the arrow. When he hits the wall, he doesn't get stuck really because his velocity drops towards 0. It does take a split second for the hit animation to finish, which I think is alright. We could have it turn off the hit animation automatically when we're in the air, or switch to a different animation if we set that up in the animation controller. But I think this is going to work pretty good okay. Alright, yeah, I like that. Okay, the last thing I want to change about the arrow is that it moves way too slow. So let's open up the arrow prefab, and I'll look in the inspector for the projectile. Let's just take the move speed and make that something like 8. Let's go into play mode, hit F, and now we have a much faster arrow. The knockback's probably too much. I mean, I only had it like that for testing. So we could take the knockback and set it to something small like 2, maybe 7 for the move speed, and damage, I'll set that to 15, why not? Use whatever numbers you want. But we can test it again. And yeah, we can see once we have it set up, it's fairly easy to make changes for how it actually works in the gameplay. And that's very dead night. Okay,